At Benny's Corner Café, Clara Hill, a scarred veteran turned waitress, serves with quiet dignity, her past as a combat medic in Afghanistan unspoken but ever present. The lunch crowd hums with familiarity until a group of city tourists arrives, led by a cruel man who mocks Clara's visible scar. The diner falls silent, tension thick as Clara retreats to the kitchen, her pain hidden behind a practiced smile. Meanwhile, Jacob Myers, a teenage cadet, watches, his anger rising. As the man's laughter lingers, Jacob's resolve hardens. Will he stay silent, or will courage break the diner's uneasy hush? If Clara and Jacob's story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support helps us share more stories of quiet courage and honor. Join our community, leave a comment, and let's keep these powerful narratives alive. Thank you for standing with us. The diner was a small, unassuming haven on the edge of a quiet Kentucky road where the coffee stayed hot, the jukebox hummed slightly off-key, and the bell above the door chimed with every arrival. Clara Hill, 48, moved behind the counter with a quiet grace, her faded blue apron tied tight, her silver name tag catching the light. The scar, a jagged line from her left eye to her chin, was impossible to miss, though most regulars had learned not to stare. It was a mark of a past she didn't share, a story etched into her skin from a time when she was more than just a waitress pouring coffee and serving pie. 16 years ago, Clara had been a field medic in Kandahar, thrust into the chaos of Operation Enduring Freedom. She didn't talk about the mortar fire or the blood-soaked sand, but those who knew her understood the scar wasn't from some clumsy accident. It was earned in a moment of raw courage when she knelt beside a young private, his legs shattered by an IED, his life slipping away. She worked with steady hands, ignoring the fear clawing at her, when a second mortar exploded nearby. Shrapnel tore across her face, the force slamming her against a Humvee. The pain was searing, but she didn't falter. She saved the boy, got him to the chopper. He lived, though she never learned his name. After 3 surgeries and a medical discharge, she returned to a small town that didn't know how to honor her. No fanfare, just VA paperwork, aching joints, and a job at Benny's Corner Café, trading plasma bags for pancake batter. The diner was her refuge now, its routine a quiet comfort after the unpredictability of war. The clink of plates, the hiss of the grill, the soft chatter of customers, it was a world she could control. That day, the lunch crowd was familiar. Truckers flipping through newspapers, a retired couple sharing a grilled cheese, a young mom coaxing her toddler to eat. Clara moved through it all with ease, her smile warm but guarded, her scar a quiet presence most folks ignored. Then the bell rang, sharp and intrusive, as 5 city folks pushed through the door. They were loud, their designer sunglasses and expensive jackets screaming wealth and privilege. Weekend tourists, likely headed to a trendy lake resort, treating Benny's like a charming backdrop for their Instagram feeds. Clara approached their table, notepad in hand, her voice steady despite the unease in her chest. "Welcome to Benny's. I'm Clara, and I'll be taking care of y'all today. Can I start you with some drinks?" The man in the navy blazer didn't look his face was smooth, his smirk faint, like the diner was a quaint joke. When he spoke, his voice was loud, cutting through the hum of the room. "If it were up to me, I wouldn't let someone like that serve food." The words were a blade aimed at Clara's scar, her sacrifice, her very presence. The diner fell silent, the air heavy with shock. Clara stood frozen by the coffee station, her hand gripping the pot, her heart pounding. Shame and defiance warred within her. She'd faced worse, bullets, blood, death, but this moment, in the place she'd made her own, cut deeper than she'd expected. No one met her eyes. The regulars stared at their plates, their coffee, anywhere but at her. Clara's mind raced, the sting of the man's words mingling with memories of Kandahar, of a war that had left her scarred in more ways than one. She wanted to speak, to reclaim her dignity, but the words wouldn't come. Then a chair scraped across the floor. Across the diner, a teenage boy in a crisp cadet uniform stood, his movements deliberate, his face set with resolve. His mother whispered, "Jake, sit down," her voice trembling with worry, but Jake didn't budge. His hands were fists, his jaw tight, his heart burning with a sense of justice. He'd grown up on stories of sacrifice, of honor, and he saw it in Clara's quiet strength. To hear her insulted and to see her humiliated was something he couldn't let pass. Every eye followed Jake as he crossed the room, his shoes clicking against the linoleum. The tourists shifted, their confidence faltering. Jake stopped beside the man's table, standing tall, his voice steady despite the nerves churning inside. That scar represents honor. You only have a mouth. The words were quiet but powerful, shattering the silence. The man blinked, his smirk gone, unnerved by the boy's conviction. Murmurs of approval rippled through the diner. The retired couple exchanged a nod, the husband's eyes shining with pride. Clara's grip on the coffee pot loosened, her gaze meeting Jake's. Gratitude flooded her, tinged with sorrow. She didn't want this boy fighting for her, but his courage stirred something deep within, a reminder of the strength she'd carried all along. The diner buzzed with the usual morning hum, clinking plates, murmured conversations, and the sizzle of bacon on the grill. Clara Hill moved through it all with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years navigating chaos. She carried a tray of water glasses, her steps deliberate, her posture straight as a soldier's. But when the man at the corner table lowered his menu, his gaze snagged on her face, tracing the jagged scar that ran from her temple to her jaw like a river cutting through a canyon. His eyes narrowed, not with curiosity, but with something sharper, something that made Clara's stomach tighten. She'd seen that look before. Judgment dressed up as pity, or worse, mockery. He winced, a theatrical grimace that seemed to pull the air from the room. Then, in a voice just loud enough to carry across the table, but too loud to be anything but intentional, he muttered, "Yikes, did Halloween show up early or what?" The words landed like a slap, sharp and stinging. One of the women at his table let out a nervous chuckle, the kind that wasn't about humor but about filling the awkward silence, about siding with the loudest voice in the room. Clara felt the heat rise in her chest, a familiar burn, but her face remained steady. She'd spent years training herself not to flinch, not to let the world see her crack. "I'll give you folks a moment with the menus," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm, as she turned away, her boots clicking softly on the linoleum. The man wasn't done. His voice rose, cutting through the diner's hum like a blade. "Hey, I asked you a question," he called after her. "What happened to your face? Fall asleep on a chainsaw or something?" The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. The diner froze. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations stumbled and died mid-sentence. Every eye in the place turned toward Clara, who stood with her back to the table, her shoulders squared, her hands still gripping the empty tray. She didn't turn around, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she said, her voice low but steady, "I'll send another server to your table." Then she walked toward the kitchen, each step measured, deliberate, as if she were marching through a minefield. Only her eyes, if anyone had been close enough to see, betrayed the sting, a flicker of pain, quickly buried. Inside, Clara's heart pounded, a rhythm she hadn't felt since the early days after her discharge. The weight of the diner's silence pressed against her, heavier than the man's words. Silence, she knew, was its own kind of cruelty. It let his mockery sit at the center of the room, unchallenged, like a guest no one dared to confront. She'd carried that weight before, not in a diner but in places far hotter, far louder, where the air smelled of smoke and blood, and the silence came only when the gunfire stopped. This moment, this small cruelty, was just another scar, invisible but as real as the one etched across her face. Clara had learned long ago that not all wounds bleed. Some fester quietly, tucked beneath the surface, hidden behind the polite smile she offered customers day after day. In the kitchen, she set the tray down with care, her hands trembling just enough to remind her of those first months back home, when the world felt too loud, too bright, too fragile. She focused on the water glasses, lining them up edge to edge, their rims touching in perfect alignment. It was a ritual, a way to ground herself, like she used to do in a combat tent with a flashlight in one hand and a morphine needle in the other. Behind her, the laughter from the tourists' table drifted in, careless and sharp, like shards of glass. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the clatter of plates and the sharp tang of grilled onions pull her back to the present. But the steam rising from the kitchen had a way of tugging her somewhere else, somewhere hotter, where the air burned her lungs and the ground shook beneath her feet. Clara Hill never spoke about Afghanistan, not because she'd forgotten, but because the memories clung to her like dust she couldn't shake off. She'd been 29 when she deployed, a combat medic with hands steadier than her nerves. She had a gift for calming soldiers, men twice her size who were unraveling under the weight of fear and pain. With a firm look and a quiet voice, she could bring them back from the edge, make them believe they'd survived the night. They used to say Clara could stitch a wound faster than most could load a rifle, and they weren't entirely wrong. Her hands moved with a precision that belied the chaos around her, threading needles through torn flesh while bullets whined overhead. The day it happened was seared into her memory, as vivid as the scar it left behind. They'd been ambushed on a supply route outside Paktika province. The convoy hit hard and fast. 3 men were down, sprawled in the dirt beside a smoking Humvee. Clara didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward them, her medical bag bouncing against her hip, her world narrowing to the task at hand. Gunfire cracked in the distance, but she tuned it out, her focus locked on the wounded. One soldier was bleeding out despite a tourniquet, his face pale and slick with sweat. Another had burned so raw his skin looked like it was melting. The third, just a kid, barely 19, wasn't moving at all. Clara dragged them to cover, one by one, her muscles screaming under the weight. She applied pressure, barked orders for evac, her voice steady even as her heart raced. She was in the middle of stabilizing the second soldier when the mortar hit. There was no warning whistle, no cinematic buildup, just a sudden deafening slam that threw her to the ground, pain ripping through her face like fire. Back in the diner, a boy in a cadet uniform sat near the back, his fork resting on his plate. He'd stopped eating, his eyes fixed on Clara as she disappeared into the kitchen. He didn't know her story, but he recognized something in her posture, in the way she carried herself through the cruelty of the moment. Maybe it was the way she held her shoulders, or the quiet dignity in her steps. Whatever it was, it stirred something in him, a respect, a question, a memory of his own training, where they taught him that courage wasn't always loud. Clara leaned against the counter in the kitchen, her breath steadying as she pushed the memory back down. She'd survived that day in Paktika, though the scar on her face was a permanent reminder of how close she'd come to not making it. The soldiers she'd saved had lived, at least long enough to make it to the evac chopper. But the kid, the 19-year-old, hadn't. His face still haunted her sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep. She didn't talk about it, not with her co-workers, not with the therapist the VA assigned her, not with anyone. The weight of those memories was hers to carry, just like the weight of the diner's silence today. She straightened, smoothing her apron, and glanced at the water glasses one last time. The trembling in her hands was gone. She'd faced worse than a cruel tourist with a loud mouth. She'd faced fire and blood and loss, and she'd come out the other side. This was just another moment, another scar to add to the collection she carried inside. Not all scars showed, but they were there, etched into her bones, her heart, her quiet smiles. And as she stepped back into the diner, ready to face the next table, Clara Hill carried them all with her, as she always would. The diner buzzed with the hum of conversations, the clink of silverware, and the sizzle of grease on the grill. Sweat beaded on the man's forehead as he lowered his menu, his gaze snagging on Clara's face. His eyes traced the jagged scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, a thin, pale line that seemed to map a story he couldn't or wouldn't understand. His lips twitched, a grimace flickering across his face, meatball and unfiltered. Inside, a mix of curiosity and discomfort churned. He didn't mean to stare, but he couldn't look away either, as if her scar demanded his attention, pulling him into a confrontation with something he wasn't ready to face. Then, in a voice just loud enough to carry across the table but too loud to be anything but intentional, he muttered, "Yikes, did Halloween come early or what?" The words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. One of the women at his table let out a nervous chuckle, her laugh brittle, more about following his lead than finding humor in the cruelty. Her cheeks flushed faintly, her eyes darting to her plate, unsure whether to lean into the moment or shrink from it. The others at the table shifted uncomfortably, their forks pausing, their smiles fading. They wanted to move on, to pretend the words hadn't been said, but the air had thickened, charged with the weight of his comment. Clara stood there, her notepad poised, her expression steady. She'd felt eyes on her scar before, countless times, and had long since mastered the art of not flinching. Inside, though, a familiar ache bloomed, a quiet, searing sting that never quite dulled, no matter how many times she faced moments like this. She wanted to snap back, to let the words she'd buried deep rise up and cut him down, but she swallowed them instead. Her voice was calm, professional, as she said, "I'll give you folks a minute to look over the menus." She turned, her movements deliberate, her back straight, as if she could will the moment away by sheer force of composure. But the man wasn't done. His voice rose, slicing through the diner's hum. "Hey!" he called after her, his tone edged with a mix of defiance and mockery. "I asked you a question. What happened to your face? Fall asleep on a chainsaw or something?" The words echoed, crude and unyielding, and the diner fell silent. Forks hovered midair. Conversations stumbled to a halt. Every pair of eyes turned, some toward the man, some toward Clara, some anywhere but the scene unfolding. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Clara froze, her back still to the table. Her heart thudded, a slow, steady rhythm that grounded her even as her mind raced. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the silent judgment, the pity, the curiosity. A part of her wanted to turn, to face him, to let him see the fire in her eyes and the strength in her stance. But she knew better. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, not because they couldn't be won, but because they cost too much. Instead, she spoke softly, her voice cutting through the silence with a quiet dignity. "I'll send another server to your table." Then she walked toward the kitchen, her steps measured, her shoulders squared. Only her eyes, if anyone had looked close enough, betrayed the hurt, a fleeting glimmer of pain, quickly buried. The diner remained hushed for a moment longer, the man's words lingering like a stain. People shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, their discomfort palpable. Later they'd tell themselves they didn't know what to do, that the moment had caught them off guard, that someone else should have spoken up. But their silence was its own kind of weight, a heavy thing that settled in the room, giving cruelty permission to sit at the table like an honored guest. Clara had carried that weight before, not just here, but in places far harsher, where silence could mean life or death. In the kitchen, Clara set her tray down on the counter, her hands trembling just enough to betray the storm inside her. The shaking reminded her of the early days after her discharge, when the world felt too loud, too bright, too fragile. She focused on the water glasses, lining them up with precision, edge to edge, as if order could anchor her. The routine was familiar, a ritual she'd leaned on years ago in a combat tent, steadying her hands with a flashlight in one and a morphine needle in the other. Behind her, the laughter from the tourist table drifted in, careless and jarring, a reminder that the world moved on, oblivious to her wounds. Somewhere near the back of the diner, a boy in a cadet uniform had stopped eating. His fork rested on his plate, his eyes fixed on Clara. He didn't know her story, but he recognized something in her posture, the quiet resilience, the way she carried herself like someone who'd seen more than most. His own dreams of service, of proving himself, felt suddenly heavier, tinged with a question he couldn't yet articulate. Clara Hill never spoke about Afghanistan, not because she'd forgotten, but because the memories were too vivid, too raw. Sometimes when the kitchen steam curled just right, mingling with the clatter of plates and the sharp tang of grilled onions, it pulled her back to that relentless heat, the kind that rose from sand and fire and fear. She'd been 29 when she first deployed, a combat medic with hands that never wavered and a voice that could soothe even the most terrified soldiers. Her unit had nicknamed her Steady Clara, joking that she could stitch a wound faster than most could load a rifle. They weren't wrong. The day it happened, they'd been ambushed near a supply route in Paktika province. The convoy had taken a hit, 3 men down in a chaos of smoke and screams. Clara didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the burning Humvee, her medical bag bouncing against her hip, her world narrowing to the task at hand. Gunfire cracked in the distance, but she barely heard it. One soldier was bleeding out, a tourniquet slipping. Another had burns so severe his skin blistered under her touch. The third, just a kid, barely 19, lay still, his eyes wide and unseeing. Clara dragged them to cover, one by one, her muscles screaming, her breath ragged. She applied pressure, shouted for evac, her voice steady even as her heart raced. When the mortar hit, it didn't whistle like in the movies. It slammed into the earth with a deafening roar, sudden and merciless. The blast threw her back, shrapnel tearing through her face, her arm, her side. She woke to pain, to blood, to the faint sound of her own breathing. But she didn't stop. She crawled back to her men, her vision blurring, her hands working on instinct. She saved 2 that day. The kid didn't make it. Clara carried that day with her, not just in the scar on her face, but in the quiet moments when the world felt too heavy. The diner, with its small cruelties, was nothing compared to the weight of those memories. But it still hurt. It always would. Her scars, visible and hidden, were a map of her battles, etched into her skin and soul. And though she smiled as she poured coffee, took orders, and moved through her days, those scars were always there, a testament to the wars she'd fought and the strength she'd found to keep going. In the haze of a sweltering afternoon, Clara stood in the bustling kitchen of Benny's Corner Café, her heart thudding like a war drum. All she'd wanted was to coast through her shift, pour coffee, scribble orders, and dodge the usual chaos of the lunch rush. She craved the simplicity of routine, the comfort of blending into the background. But cruelty, like a predator, always seemed to sniff out the ones who tried to stay invisible. Behind her, the air in the diner felt charged, heavy with the unspoken. She could sense it, the room tilting, the murmurs shifting. Somewhere out there, the man who'd hurled his venom at her was still chuckling, his voice grating against her nerves. But someone else had seen it all. Someone hadn't turned away. Across the diner, Jacob Myers sat motionless in a corner booth, his grilled cheese sandwich congealing on the plate, his sweet tea sweating untouched. At 16, he was all sharp angles and restless energy, his lanky frame still catching up to his ambitions. His Riverside Military Academy uniform, crisp gray with deep blue piping and a gleaming brass pin, clung to him like a second skin, a badge of pride that felt heavier today than ever before. He'd come to this small-town diner expecting nothing more than a quick bite with his mom, Laura, on their way back from Lexington, where they'd visited his father's memorial. Captain Michael Myers, gone 2 years now, had left a void that Jacob carried like a stone in his chest. The trip had been quiet, reverent, but this moment in the diner was anything but. Jacob's dark eyes, fierce and unyielding, were fixed on a table near the center of the room. He hadn't looked away since the man in the navy blazer, a smug, loud type with a voice that carried, had flung his first cruel jab at Clara. The words had sliced through the hum of the diner, sharp and deliberate, mocking the scar that marred her face. Jacob's stomach churned, not just at the man's callousness, but at the silence that followed. The other patrons, some in ball caps with military insignias, others with weathered faces that hinted at their own battles, kept their heads down. Forks scraped plates, eyes studied napkins. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the room had collectively decided to let the moment pass, to let Clara bear the weight alone. That silence gnawed at Jacob. He'd grown up on stories of honor, of men and women who stood tall in the face of wrong. His father had been one of them, a soldier who'd led with courage until a roadside bomb in Herat stole him away. At the academy, Jacob's instructors preached the same values: follow with discipline, lead with bravery. But here, in the real world, the adults he'd looked up to were failing. The veterinarians at the counter, the waitresses bustling past, even the manager wiping down the register. They all let the moment slip by. It made Jacob's chest tighten, his jaw clenched so hard he could feel the pulse in his temples. His right hand, resting in his lap, twitched as if itching to act, to do something to right this wrong. Across the table, Laura watched her son with a mother's quiet dread. She knew that look, the way his eyes narrowed, the muscle in his cheek flickering like a warning signal. She'd seen it before, in the months after Michael's death, when Jacob had retreated into himself, only to emerge with a steely resolve that both awed and frightened her. "Jacob," she murmured, her voice soft but urgent, barely cutting through the diner's clatter. "Don't." He didn't flinch, his gaze still locked on the man's table. "She didn't deserve that," he said, his voice low but edged with conviction. His words carried the weight of everything he'd bottled up: the grief for his father, the pressure of the uniform, the disappointment in the adults who had let this slide. "I know, honey," Laura replied, her heart aching. She wasn't angry, just scared. She'd spent 2 years piecing their lives back together after Michael's death. The knock at the door, the folded flag, the unbearable quiet of a house without him. She'd survived it, but barely. Jacob had been her anchor, even as he grappled with his own pain. He'd stopped talking for days after the funeral, his silence louder than any sob. Since then, he'd poured himself into the academy, earning praise for a discipline that seemed almost unnatural for a boy his age. He wore his father's dog tags under his shirt, a secret tether to the man he'd lost. And Laura knew he saw his father in moments like this, in the chance to stand up, to make things right. Jacob's eyes flicked to Clara as she emerged from the kitchen, her tray wobbling slightly in her hands. He didn't know her name, but he'd watched every second of her ordeal. The way her shoulders had stiffened under the man's words, the way her fingers had trembled as she retreated. The way the scar on her face, jagged, raw, a mark of survival, had become the man's cruel punchline. To Jacob, that scar wasn't a flaw. It was a medal, a sign of battles fought and won. He didn't need her story to know she'd endured something profound, something that deserved respect, not scorn. And the fact that no one else saw it that way made his blood burn. Laura reaching for his hand, her touch a silent plea. "This isn't our fight," she said, her voice cracking with worry. She hated how hollow it sounded, how it echoed the apathy of the room. But she couldn't lose him. Not to a confrontation, not to the anger she saw simmering in his eyes. Jacob's gaze softened for a moment, meeting hers. "That's the problem," he said, his voice barely audible but resolute. "It's never anyone's fight until someone claims it." His words hung between them, heavy with the truth he'd learned too young. That courage wasn't just for battlefields. It was for places like this, a small town diner where a waitress carried her scars, and a boy in a cadet uniform decided he wouldn't look away. Jacob sat at the worn wooden table in Benny's diner, his fork scraping against the chipped plate as he pushed his half-eaten meal aside. The weight of the brass pin on his chest, a small eagle etched into a circular seal, pressed against his heart. He'd earned it last semester, standing tall. During a search and rescue drill, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The memory of his mother's tears, pride mixed with something softer, almost fragile, flashed through his mind. She'd clutched his hand that day, her smile trembling as they pinned the badge to his uniform. But today, that same pin felt hollow, like a trophy for a game that didn't matter. Real leadership, he was beginning to understand, wasn't found in staged drills or polished ceremonies. It lived in moments like this, raw and unscripted, where the world demanded more than practiced moves. Across the diner, the man in the navy blazer was still laughing, his voice sharp and grating, though the sound had grown thinner now, tinged with unease. His companions chuckled along, but their laughter faltered, awkward and forced, as if they sensed the cruelty in it but lacked the courage to stop. Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd seen that kind of cruelty before, not just in words, but in the deeper truths it tried to hide. He'd glimpsed it as a boy, trailing behind his father at the military base, the walls lined with faded photos of soldiers who'd returned changed. He'd felt it in the VA waiting rooms, where men sat with distant gazes, their silence louder than any story they could tell. And he'd carried it home in the shoebox under his bed, filled with photographs of his father. Smiling in one, hollow-eyed in the next. Service-left scars, some visible, most buried deep. But they were all real, and they shaped you in ways no one else could see. Jacob's mother looked up from her plate, her fork pausing midair. "Jacob, wait," she said, her voice soft but urgent, sensing the storm brewing in her son's eyes. But he was already on his feet, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a clarity that burned through his doubt. At the center of the diner, the man in the blazer hadn't noticed him yet, too caught up in his own performance. The waitress, Clara, hadn't returned to their table. Another woman, older and visibly nervous, had taken her place, scribbling their order with unsteady hands. But Jacob's eyes weren't on them anymore. They were fixed on Clara, standing by the coffee station, her back straight as she arranged mugs with deliberate care. She moved with a quiet dignity, pretending not to hear the whispers that still hung in the air like a bitter fog. Her shoulders sagged slightly, betraying a weariness that tugged at Jacob's chest. But there was strength there too, a resilience that refused to bend. He saw it in the way she kept working, head held high, even as the room's judgment pressed against her. Jacob exhaled, his breath steadying as his father's words echoed in his mind. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly and refuses to give up. Those words had been a lifeline when he was younger, when he'd lie awake wondering if he could ever measure up to the man his father had been. Now they were a call to action, louder than the hum of the diner's fluorescent lights or the clink of silverware. He took a step forward, then another, each one deliberate, his shoes tapping softly against the floor. The air in Benny's diner shifted, not because of raised voices or thrown punches, but because one teenage boy in a cadet uniform decided he couldn't stay seated any longer. The sound of his steps, barely audible, carried a weight that silenced the room. Forks hovered over plates. Conversations trailed off. Even the jukebox in the corner seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. At the table by the window, the man in the blazer finally looked up, his smirk still lingering from his earlier taunts. He wasn't expecting this, not from a kid, not from someone who looked like he belonged in a classroom, not a confrontation. "Well, look at this," he said, nudging one of his companions with a mocking grin. "We've got ourselves a junior G.I. Joe." His voice dripped with condescension, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, a crack in his bravado. His friends snickered, but it was a nervous sound, like they were trying to convince themselves he was still in control. Jacob didn't waver. He stopped a foot from the table, his hands falling naturally to his sides, fingers relaxed but steady as if he'd practiced this moment 1,000 times. He stood at parade rest, just as he'd been taught, his posture calm but unyielding. The diner fell into a deeper hush, the kind of stillness that makes your heartbeat feel too loud. Even Clara, still by the coffee station, turned to look, her hands freezing mid-task. At first, her expression was puzzled, her brows knitting together as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Then, as her eyes locked onto Jacob's, something shifted in her face. Recognition, maybe, or something deeper, like gratitude she hadn't yet known how to name. When Jacob spoke, his voice was low, steady, but resonant, cutting through the silence like a bell. "That scar," he said, nodding gently toward Clara. "It's a story of honor." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of everything he'd seen and felt. The photos, the VA rooms, the men who'd come home carrying burdens no one could lift for them. He turned his gaze to the man in the blazer, his blue eyes unwavering. "All you've got is a mouth." A soft gasp rippled through the diner, a spoon clinking against a mug somewhere near the counter. A sharp intake of breath from a nearby table. The man's smirk vanished, his face flushing as he sat up straighter, trying to reclaim the moment. "Listen, kid," he started, his tone sharper now, defensive. "This is grown-up business. Why don't you go back to your video games and let the adults—" "I know exactly what this is," Jacob cut in, his voice not rising but growing harder, like iron. "It's cowardice pretending to be confidence." The words landed like a blow, and the diner seemed to hold its collective breath. The man's companions shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the tablecloth, the window, anywhere but Jacob's face. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she set down the last mug she'd been arranging, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her posture straightened further, as if Jacob's words had given her something to stand taller for. The room was no longer just watching out of curiosity. It was witnessing something. A moment where the truth, quiet but unyielding, had walked in and refused to sit down. Jacob stood there, a boy in a uniform that suddenly felt heavier, not with regret, but with purpose. He'd seen the marked service left, the ones you could see and the ones you couldn't. And in that diner under the flickering lights, he'd chosen to honor them, not with a badge or a drill, but with courage that didn't need to shout. The diner was alive with the familiar hum of life, forks scraping against plates, the low murmur of conversation, and the soft clinking of dishes being cleared from tables. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, a subtle shift hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Clara felt it in the way the room seemed to hold its breath, in the way eyes no longer lingered on the jagged scar that traced her jawline. For so long, that scar had defined her to strangers, a map of pain etched into her skin from a past she rarely spoke of. But today, the gazes that met hers were different, steady, respectful, searching her eyes rather than her wounds. As she moved through the diner, wiping down a table, a woman rose from her seat, her face soft with gratitude. She pressed a folded $10 bill into Clara's hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din, yet it landed in Clara's chest like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through her thoughts. Clara nodded, her throat tight, unsure what she'd done to earn such quiet reverence. Near the counter, Jacob Meyer stood beside his mother, waiting to settle their bill. His cadet uniform was crisp, the creases sharp, his polished shoes catching the dim light of the diner's fluorescent bulbs. But there was something new in his posture, a weight, a gravity that hadn't been there when he'd walked in earlier. It was as if the meal, the moment, had carved something deeper into him, a realization that pressed against his young shoulders. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye, her hands fidgeting with a towel, more out of nervous habit than any real need to clean them. She approached, her steps deliberate, her heart a little unsteady. "You heading out?" she asked, her voice carrying a warmth she hoped masked the flutter of nerves in her chest. "Yes, ma'am," Jacob replied, his spine straightening instinctively, as if he were standing at attention before a commanding officer. His formality made her smile, though it was tinged with a bittersweet ache. "You don't have to call me ma'am," she said softly, her tone teasing but kind. "Not after what you did today." Jacob's eyes dropped to the floor, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "I just said what needed saying," he murmured, almost shymossy, as if the weight of his own actions embarrassed him. But Clara saw more than his humility. She saw the echo of someone she'd known years ago, a young medic in Bagram, all wide-eyed ideals and reckless courage, always the first to run toward danger. That medic's face flashed in her mind, his laughter, his unwavering belief in doing what was right. He hadn't come home. The memory stung, sharp and sudden, but she pushed it down, focusing on the boy in front of her. "You did more than speak," she said, her voice gentle but firm, like a hand steadying someone on uneven ground. "You stood up. That's not as easy as it seems." Jacob hesitated, his hand hovering near the inside pocket of his uniform jacket. His fingers trembled, not from fear, Clara knew, but from the weight of the moment, the kind of weight that settles in when you realize you're part of something bigger than yourself. "I wanted to give you something," he said, his voice quiet but steady, like a river finding its course. He drew out a small brass pin, its surface worn but meticulously polished, shaped like an eagle with a shield across its chest. The sight of it caught Clara off guard, her breath hitching as she took in its significance. "This was awarded to me last semester," Jacob explained, his eyes fixed on the pin as if it held his entire story. "For leading a rescue drill during field training. They said I showed courage under pressure." Clara's lips parted, ready to protest, but Jacob pressed on, holding the pin out between them like an offering. "Today I realized I didn't earn this nearly as much as I thought I did," he said, his voice cracking just enough to betray the depth of his emotion. "You've been living that courage every day, ma'am, every single day." Clara stared at the pin resting in his open palm, her throat tightening until it hurt to swallow. The brass gleamed faintly, catching the light, and for a moment she was back in the dust and chaos of a battlefield tent, her hands steady as she held a morphine syringe, knowing it could save a life or end one if she faltered. That same reverence, that same weight, pulsed through her now. "I can't take this," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "It means something to you." "It still does," Jacob said, his eyes meeting hers with a clarity that made her heart ache. But it means more to me if it's with someone who showed me what real honor looks like. His words weren't flattery, they were raw, unpolished truth, and they struck her like a wave, washing away the walls she'd built to keep such truths at a distance. For a moment, she didn't see a boy, not even a cadet, but a soul who understood the cost of standing tall, the quiet strength it took to carry scars, visible or not. Slowly, her hand trembling as much as his had, Clara reached out and took the pin. Her fingers closed around it, holding it with the same care she'd once reserved for the most fragile things in her life, lives she'd fought to save, promises she'd made to herself in the dark. "Thank you," she said, her voice so soft it barely broke the air between them. Jacob nodded a single sharp motion, his eyes bright with something unspoken. His mother, standing quietly to the side, watched the exchange with a stillness that spoke of her own pride and pain. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she brushed it away quickly, as if hoping no one would notice. Clara caught her eye, and for a moment they shared a look that needed no words. A mother's quiet strength, a soldier's unspoken grief. "I think your father would have been proud today," Clara said, her voice steady now, meeting Jacob's gaze. The words landed heavily, and Jacob swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure. "So would yours," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, the world fell away. The diner's clatter, the clinking dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, the murmur of other patrons, faded into a distant hum. It was just the two of them, bound by something deeper than words. Shared service, shared sacrifice, shared silence. Clara felt it in her bones, a connection that transcended the moment, tying her to this young man who, in his own way, carried the same weight she did. Then, like a soldier returning to her post, Clara straightened, her resolve snapping back into place. She walked to the break room, her steps steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Opening the small metal locker where she kept her things, she pinned the brass eagle next to her name tag. C. Hill. It didn't shine brightly, not like it might have once, but it carried a quiet power, a reminder of what she'd survived and what she'd inspired. She stood there for a moment, her fingers lingering on the pin, feeling its weight, its promise, its truth. The brass pin on Clara's apron rested against her chest, heavier than the service pins she'd once worn with pride, yet imbued with a deeper truth that seemed to anchor her soul. It wasn't just metal, it carried the weight of years, of battles fought and survived, of wounds both visible and hidden. As the dinner shift kicked off at the small Kentucky diner, Clara glided through her familiar routine, pouring steaming coffee into chipped mugs, wiping down tables sticky with syrup, and flashing warm smiles at the regulars who knew her by name. But tonight, each step felt different. The pin wasn't the only thing pressing against her heart. It was the sensation of being truly seen, not as the broken woman some whispered about, not as the waitress with scars etched into her skin, but as someone who had faced the fire of life and kept showing up day after day. Outside, the Kentucky sky burned with a golden hue, the kind of light that transformed rusty tractors and faded gas station signs into something almost sacred, like brushstrokes on a canvas. Clara caught her reflection in the diner's front window as she passed by, pausing for a moment. For years, that glass had shown her a face she barely recognized, marred by the past, shadowed by pain. She'd see the scars, the lines carved by trauma, and feel the weight of judgment in the eyes of strangers. But today, something shifted. In that fleeting reflection, she didn't see damage. She saw resilience. She saw a woman who had endured, who had carried her burdens with quiet strength. The brass pin gleamed beside her name tag, a small beacon of light that felt like it had always belonged there, as if it were a part of her story all along. Clara's heart swelled with a mix of pride and vulnerability. The pin wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of recognition, a quiet nod to her sacrifices from a young man who had looked at her with eyes full of respect, not pity. She thought back to the moment he'd approached her, his voice steady but soft, saying, "I see what you've done. I honor it." Those words had pierced through the armor she'd built over years of silence, years of serving coffee, and dodging whispers about her past. She wasn't just a waitress to him. She was a veteran, a survivor, a hero in an apron instead of a uniform. That simple act of acknowledgement had stirred something deep within her, a warmth that battled the cold ache of her scars. Heroes don't always wear capes or carry rifles. Sometimes they wear aprons, balancing trays of burgers and milkshakes while navigating the chaos of a busy diner. Sometimes their battles are fought in the quiet moments, enduring the sting of a cruel comment, the weight of a customer's dismissive glance, or the silence of a world that moves too fast to notice. Clara knew this truth intimately. Her scars weren't just the visible ones from her time in service. They were the invisible ones, carved by the way people looked at her, or didn't, the way they averted their eyes when they saw her limp, the way they lowered their voices when they thought she couldn't hear. But that young man's gesture, pinning the brass to her apron, had shifted something inside her. It was as if he'd handed her a piece of her dignity back, a piece she hadn't realized she'd lost. Clara's story wasn't just about one cruel man who'd once mocked her scars, nor was it only about the brave boy who'd stood up for her. It was about the choices we make and how we treat one another. It was about looking past the surface, past the apron, the scars, the tired smile, and seeing the battles someone has fought, even if those battles were waged in places we'll never see. Clara thought about the regulars she served, the ones who came in every day with their own burdens. There was Mr. Thompson, whose hands trembled from years of hard labor, and Jenny, the single mom who always tipped in coins because it was all she had. Clara saw them, really saw them, and in her quiet way, she honored their struggles with a kind word or an extra moment of patience. In today's world, life moves at a relentless pace. People scroll through their phones, rush through their days, and avoid eye contact in crowded spaces. Clara felt it every shift, the way customers barely looked up from their screens, their minds already elsewhere. But what people need, she thought, isn't pity or applause. It's recognition, a simple na'ainisum, a kind word, a moment of connection that says, I see you. I see your strength. That young man in the diner had given her that gift, and it had changed her. It hadn't erased her scars, but it had softened their edges, made them feel less like wounds and more like stories. As Clara refilled a coffee cup, her mind wandered to the others who served quietly, teachers staying late to help struggling students, nurses working double shifts, parents sacrificing sleep to care for their kids. She wondered if they too felt unseen at times, their courage overlooked in the rush of everyday life. And she thought about the times she'd stayed silent herself, witnessing someone's pain and not knowing what to say. What could she say next time? What words would carry the weight of recognition, the way that young man's words had for her? The diner buzzed around her, filled with the clink of dishes and the hum of conversation. But Clara felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. She would keep showing up, keep serving, keep seeing the people around her. And maybe, just maybe, she could offer a nod or a kind word to someone else who needed it. Because sometimes the smallest gesture, a pin, a word, a glance, could carry the weight of 1,000 battles won. And in that Kentucky diner under a golden sky, Clara felt the truth of it. The deepest scars aren't always on the skin. They're in the silences we leave unbroken, the moments we choose not to see. But when someone does see, when they stand up and speak out, those scars begin to heal, one quiet act of decency at a time.